I heard my daughter scream before I saw the police lights. I was in the kitchen, still in my scrubs, from a 12-hour shift, when the sound hit me. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was the kind of scream that makes every hair on your body stand up. I ran to the front door and threw it open, and what I saw stopped me cold. Two police cruisers were parked in front of my house, lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. My neighbors were already stepping onto their porches, arms crossed, watching. And there, in the middle of my front yard, was my 16-year-old daughter Lily, her hands behind her back, a pair of handcuffs clicking into place around her wrists. Her whole body was shaking. One of the officers spoke in a flat, practiced voice, reading her the Miranda rights like it was just another Tuesday. I could barely breathe. The charge was hit and run, and the vehicle involved was the car she'd been given as a birthday gift just 5 weeks before. At that moment, I had no idea the truth had been carefully planned long before that birthday party ever happened. Hi everyone. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 35 years old. I'm an ER nurse in Dallas, Texas, and this story started about 2 weeks before my daughter turned 16. Before I get into what happened, I need you to understand what my life looked like back then, because it matters. I wasn't living some easy, comfortable life. I was grinding. Every single day. I was working night shifts at the emergency room 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. I'd come home at 7 in the morning, make Lily breakfast, help her get ready for school, and then crash for a few hours before doing it all over again. There was no backup, no one to tag in when I was exhausted. It had been just the two of us for a long time. I lost my husband when Lily was 9. A car accident. And after that, I made a decision that I was going to hold everything together no matter what it cost me. For 6 years, I did exactly that. But holding everything together is expensive. And I don't just mean money. Our car was a 2009 Honda Civic with over 180,000 miles on it. The check engine light had been on for 8 months. I couldn't afford to fix it, and I couldn't afford to replace it. Lily never complained. That's the thing about her. She's always been mature beyond her age, always aware of what I was carrying, always trying to make things easier for me instead of harder. She deserved so much more than I could give her at the time, and I felt that guilt every single day. Now, my brother Jake is a different story. He's 3 years younger than me, 32, and his life had always been a little all over the place. Different jobs, different cities, different stories about why things didn't work out. He wasn't a bad person, I told myself. He was just unreliable. Those two things felt different to me back then. They don't anymore. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, Jake called me. And everything changed. My brother never called unless he needed something. That was just the pattern we'd fallen into over the years. It was always some version of the same story. He was in between jobs, or a deal fell through, or he just needed to borrow a little to get through the month. So when his name showed up on my screen that Tuesday afternoon, I almost didn't pick up. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot, still wired from a brutal overnight shift, and I just stared at the phone for a few seconds. Then I answered anyway, because he was still my brother. Right away, his voice was different, lighter, almost excited. He didn't ask for anything. Instead, he launched into this whole thing about how he'd been doing really well lately, how he'd made some smart moves financially, and how he wanted to do something meaningful for the family. I remember sitting up straighter in my seat, because that was not the Jake I knew. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He leaned into the phone and said with real enthusiasm, "Listen, Lily's birthday is coming up. I want to throw her a party. A real one. Let me handle everything." Right away, something in my chest tightened. Not with excitement, with caution. Because in my experience, when Jake said, "Let me handle everything," what he usually meant was, "Let me start something and then disappear when it gets complicated." I told him honestly, "Jake, I appreciate it, but Lily doesn't need anything big. She's happy with low-key." Without missing a beat, he pushed back and said with that smooth confidence of his, "Come on, She's turning 16. This is a big deal. Just let me do this. I want to be a better uncle. I want to show up for you guys. And there it was, that sentence. I want to show up for you guys. I'd been waiting to hear something like that from him for years. Looking back now, I can see exactly how calculated that moment was. But standing in that parking lot, exhausted and emotionally worn down, I wanted to believe him so badly. Over the next few days, Jake started calling more often. He'd check in with little updates. He found a venue. He was handling the catering. He'd already talked to Mom and Dad, and they were on board. Slowly, the rest of the family started getting pulled in. My mom called me, genuinely excited, saying warmly, "This is so good, Sarah. Jake's really stepping up. It's going to be special." Even my dad, who was usually the quiet one, sent me a text that just said, "Let the boy do something good for once." And then there was Lily. When I told her that her uncle was planning a real birthday party for her whole face changed. She looked at me with those big eyes and said softly, almost like she was afraid to hope, "Wait, seriously? Like a real party?" I nodded. And she smiled the kind of smile I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. That smile was what got me. I let my guard down completely in that moment, because I was so desperate to give her something I couldn't afford to give her myself. And here was someone offering to fill that gap. I told Jake to go ahead. I said yes to all of it. And once I said yes, things moved fast. Jake was suddenly everywhere, texting me daily, sending me venue photos, asking for Lily's guest list, checking what her favorite colors were. He was thorough in a way that surprised me. At the time, I thought it was just enthusiasm. Now I understand it was preparation. There was one moment, about a week before the party, where something nagged at me. Jake mentioned casually over the phone, "Oh, I'm also putting together a little something extra for her. A surprise. Nothing crazy, just something she'll remember." I asked him what it was. He just laughed and said with a grin in his voice, "Trust me, you're going to love it." I let it go. I trusted him. And right there, in that small moment of letting go, I made the first mistake that would unravel everything. The day of the party, I barely recognized the venue. Jake had rented out a banquet hall on the north side of Dallas, one of those places with high ceilings and string lights and round tables draped in white linen. There were balloons everywhere in Lily's favorite colors, lavender and gold. A catering team was setting up a full spread along one wall. There was even a DJ in the corner, testing the sound system when we walked in. I stood in the doorway and just looked at it all. For a second, I genuinely didn't know what to feel. It was beautiful. More than beautiful. It was the kind of party I had always wished I could give her, and never could. Lily walked in beside me, and the moment she took it all in, she grabbed my arm with both hands and said in a breathless whisper, her voice cracking just slightly, "Mom, oh my God. Mom, look at this." I squeezed her hand. I didn't trust myself to say anything right then. Within an hour, the place was packed. Friends from school, neighbors, extended family members I hadn't seen in years. Everyone was dressed up, laughing, taking photos. And at the center of all of it, working the room like he was born for it, was Jake. He moved from group to group with this easy confidence, shaking hands, telling stories, making everyone laugh. I watched him from across the room and felt something complicated settle in my chest. This was a side of my brother I hadn't seen before, charming in a way that felt almost too polished, too rehearsed. Our mom floated over to me at one point, glowing, and said, squeezing my arm with pride, "Look at what he did. I told you he was stepping up." I smiled and nodded, but my eyes stayed on Jake. He was eating up every compliment, every thank you, every moment of attention, and it hit me slowly, like a cold draft moving through the room. This party wasn't really for Lily, it was for him. It was a performance, and every person in that room was the audience. But I pushed that thought down, because Lily was happy. Genuinely, visibly, radiantly happy. She was dancing with her friends, laughing so hard she had to hold her stomach, and at one point she caught my eye from across the dance floor and mouthed the words, "Thank you, Mom." That was enough to quiet everything else in my head. About 2 hours in, Jake tapped the microphone and got everyone's attention. The DJ cut the music, the room settled. Jake stood up there with a big grin and launched into this speech about family, about showing up for the people you love, about how proud he was of Lily and how much she deserved to be celebrated. People were nodding. Someone near me said quietly, "He's such a good guy." The words landed on me like something slightly off-key, like a note that's almost right but not quite. Then Jake looked over at Lily and said with the whole room watching, "I told you I had one more surprise, and I meant it." He stepped off the little stage and walked toward the side door of the banquet hall. Everyone followed with their eyes. He pushed the door open and propped it wide, then turned back to Lily with a grin and said, holding out his hand, "Come here, come see." Lily looked at me quickly, her eyes wide and uncertain, and then she followed him outside. I followed too, along with half the room. And there, parked in the side lot under a strand of lights that Jake had clearly set up in advance, was a car. A white Honda Civic, newer model, clean, with a giant red bow on the roof. The crowd reacted immediately. People gasped. Someone started clapping, and within seconds, the whole group joined in. Jake walked over to the car, pulled a set of keys from his jacket pocket, and held them up in the air. Then he turned to Lily and said loud enough for everyone to hear, clearly performing for the crowd, "Happy birthday, she's all yours." Lily stood completely still for a moment. Then she turned to look at me, and the expression on her face was something I will never forget. Pure, overwhelming joy mixed with total disbelief. She looked back at Jake and said, pressing both hands to her face, "Are you serious? Is this real?" Jake laughed and pressed the keys into her hands. The crowd cheered again, and I stood there at the edge of that parking lot, watching my daughter hold those keys like they were something precious, and felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the night air. Something was wrong. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it. Before the cheering even died down, Jake was already moving. He stepped around to the hood of the car, reached through the open passenger window, and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thick, organized, like he'd had it ready for a while. He walked it over to me, not to Lily, to me, and held it out with that same easy grin and said, keeping his voice low, so only I could hear, "Just some paperwork. Title transfer, insurance info, the usual stuff. I need your signature to make it official." Right away, something shifted in my stomach. I looked at the envelope and then back at him and said carefully, "What exactly am I signing?" Without any hesitation, still smiling, he said, brushing it off like it was nothing, "It's just the transfer documents, standard stuff. You're listed as a co-signer since she's a minor. Nothing complicated." Around us, people were still celebrating. Someone had started playing music again from inside. Lily was behind me, already showing the car to her friends, laughing and unlocking it and climbing in the driver's seat just to feel what it felt like. I could hear her through the noise, her voice bright and full in a way I hadn't heard in so long. And then my mom appeared at my elbow, smiling, and said, glancing at the envelope, "Just sign it, Sarah. Don't overthink everything. This is a good thing." I opened the envelope. Inside were several pages, dense with legal language, ownership transfer forms, what looked like insurance documentation, and a few other pages I didn't fully process. The print was small, the language was technical, and I was running on 4 hours of sleep after a night shift that had included 2 trauma cases and a cardiac event. Jake handed me a pen. The crowd was still buzzing around us. Lily leaned out the car window. "It smells like a new car. Come smell it." Everyone around us laughed. I looked at my daughter's face. Then I looked at the papers. I skimmed the first page. I saw Lily's name. I saw Jake's name. I saw something about insurance coverage and registration. I did not read the dates. I did not read the fine print on page 3. I did not ask why there were so many pages for what he called a standard transfer. I took the pen and I signed. 3 places. wherever Jake pointed. Each time he turned to the next page and said calmly, "Just here, and one more right here." When it was done, he took the papers back smoothly, slid them into the envelope, and tucked it under his arm. Then he patted me on the shoulder and said with a satisfied look in his eyes, "Perfect. I'll get everything filed on Monday." I handed him back the pen. And that was it. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes that I have replayed in my head hundreds of times since then, looking for the moment I could have stopped it. Looking for the version of myself that slows down, asks the right questions, says, "Not yet, let me read this properly first." But that version of me wasn't there that night. That night, I was a tired single mom, watching her daughter be happy for the first time in what felt like forever. And I wanted so badly to just let it be good. So I let it be good. I folded that caution up and put it away. I went and sat in the passenger seat of that white Honda Civic next to my daughter, and I let her tell me about every feature on the dashboard, and I laughed when she pretended to drive, and I took a photo of her behind the wheel that I posted to my phone's camera roll with a caption I never shared anywhere because some moments feel too tender to put online. That night, driving home, Lily said quietly from the back seat with her head leaning against the window, "This was the best day of my life." I smiled at her in the rearview mirror. I had no idea it was also the beginning of the worst. 5 weeks later, someone knocked on my door, like they were trying to break it down. It was a Thursday afternoon, just after 4. I had just gotten home from a double shift and was still in my scrubs, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, trying to decide if I had enough energy to make dinner, or if cereal was going to have to be enough. Lily was upstairs in her room. I could hear her music through the ceiling, the low thump of whatever she was listening to that week. Everything felt completely ordinary. And then the knock came. 3 hard, heavy pounds on the front door. The kind of knock that doesn't sound like a neighbor or a delivery driver. The kind of knock that makes your body respond before your brain does. I set down the glass and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch, and behind them, parked at the curb, 2 police cruisers with their lights off but their presence impossible to ignore. My hand was already cold when I turned the knob. I opened the door, and the taller of the 2 officers looked at me steadily and said without any warmth in his voice, "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" I said yes. He said, holding up a document, "Is Lily Mitchell a resident at this address?" My throat tightened. I said yes again. He said, looking past me toward the stairs, "We need to speak with her. There's been an incident involving a vehicle registered in her name." Everything slowed down. I turned toward the stairs and called up in a voice I was trying to keep even, "Lily, can you come down here, please?" A few seconds passed. Then I heard her door open, her footsteps on the stairs, and she appeared at the bottom, landing in a sweatshirt and leggings, her hair pulled back, looking young and completely unbothered, the way teenagers look before the world drops something on them. The moment she saw the officers, her face changed. The color drained out of it so fast it was like watching a light switch off. She looked at me and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Mom, what's happening?" I didn't have an answer. One of the officers asked her to step outside. I followed immediately, and that was when I saw my neighbors. The woman across the street was standing in her driveway pretending to check her mail. The couple 2 houses down had drifted to their front window. That particular kind of neighborhood attention that feels like a wall closing in. On the porch, the officer explained the situation in clipped, efficient language. 5 weeks ago, on a Saturday evening, a vehicle registered to Lily Mitchell had been involved in a hit-and-run accident at an intersection about 4 miles from our house. A man on a bicycle had been struck. He had suffered a broken collarbone and a fractured wrist. He had been hospitalized. The vehicle had fled the scene. Witnesses had recorded a partial plate. The plate matched the white Honda Civic registered in Lily's name. Lily stood absolutely still through all of this. Then she turned to me with her eyes wide and said with a shaking voice, desperate and confused, "Mom, I didn't do that. I wasn't even driving that night. I was home. You were home. Tell them I was home. And she was right. I knew exactly where she had been that Saturday evening because we had watched a movie together on the couch, and she had fallen asleep before it ended, and I had put a blanket over her. She had not been in that car. She had not been anywhere near that intersection. But the officer looked at his paperwork and said without emotion, reading directly from the document, "According to registration records, the vehicle has been in the legal ownership of Lily Mitchell since 3 weeks prior to the incident." 3 weeks prior. Something about that number hit me wrong. Immediately. 3 weeks prior to the accident would have been 2 weeks before the birthday party. 2 weeks before Jake had even given us the car. I felt the ground shift under me in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I looked at the document the officer was holding. I could see the registration date printed clearly in black ink. And in that moment, standing on my own porch while my daughter shook beside me and my neighbors watched from their yards, a cold and terrible understanding began to move through me, like ice water spreading from my chest outward. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a clerical error. Somebody had put my daughter's name on that car long before the party, long before the bow, long before the keys. And I had signed the papers that made it all look legitimate. They took us to the station that evening. Not in the back of a cruiser, they weren't arresting Lily yet, but they made it clear that wasn't off the table. One of the officers drove us while another followed behind, and the whole ride I sat in the back seat next to my daughter with her hand wrapped in both of mine, trying to project a calm I absolutely did not feel. Lily didn't say anything the entire way there. She just stared out the window with this hollow, glassy look that I recognized from the weeks after her dad died. That look of someone whose brain has decided to go somewhere else because the present moment is too much to process. The station was loud and fluorescent and smelled like burnt coffee. They put us in a small room with a table and 4 chairs and a large mirror along one wall that wasn't fooling anyone. A detective came in about 15 minutes later. He was maybe 50, heavyset, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a manila folder in his hand. He sat down across from us, opened the folder, spread a few documents on the table, and said, looking directly at me, "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to walk you through what we have, and I need you to be straight with me." I told him I wasn't married. It was Miss Mitchell, and yes, I would be completely straight with him because my daughter had nothing to do with this. He nodded like he'd heard that before and pushed one of the documents toward me. It was the vehicle registration. My eyes went straight to the date. The car had been registered in Lily's name on a date that was 17 days before her birthday party. 17 days before Jake stood in that parking lot with a red bow on the roof and a set of keys in his hand and performed his big, generous uncle routine for a room full of people. I stared at that date for a long moment, and the detective watched me stare at it, and then he said with a careful, measured tone, "The vehicle was registered to your daughter before the party, where you say it was gifted. Which means either the timeline you've described is inaccurate, or someone filed these documents ahead of the event." I looked up at him and said, keeping my voice as level as I could, "Someone filed them ahead of the event, because that date is impossible. We didn't have that car until the party." He made a note. Then he slid another document across the table. It was a copy of the paperwork I had signed that night in the parking lot. My signature was right there, clear as anything, on page 2. And below my signature, in a section I had not read, was a clause that listed the effective date of ownership transfer. That date matched the registration. It was backdated. My stomach dropped so hard and so fast that I actually put my hand on the table to steady myself. Lily looked at me and said, gripping my arm with both hands, "Mom, what is it? What does it say?" I couldn't answer her right away. The detective leaned forward and said quietly, watching my face, "Miss Mitchell, were you aware that the paperwork you signed at the party contained a backdated transfer date?" I told him no. "Absolutely not." He wrote something down. Then he said, closing the folder slightly, "The cyclist who was hit has filed a formal complaint. He has medical bills and lost wages. His attorney is pursuing damages. Because the vehicle is registered to your daughter and the transfer date puts ownership with her at the time of the accident, she is currently the liable party. The word liable sat in the middle of that table like something with weight. Lily made a sound beside me that wasn't quite a word. I reached over and put my arm around her shoulders and felt how rigid her whole body was, how hard she was working to hold herself together. A few minutes later, a woman in a blazer came in and introduced herself as a legal aid attorney, assigned to juvenile cases. She sat beside us and started explaining Lily's options in a calm, practiced voice, but I could barely track what she was saying because my brain had already left that room. It had gone back to the party, back to that parking lot, back to Jake's hand on my shoulder after I signed, that satisfied look in his eyes. The way he tucked that envelope under his arm so smoothly and said he'd get everything filed on Monday. He already had it filed. He had filed it weeks earlier. The car had never really been a gift. It had been a document. A piece of paper with my daughter's name on it, prepared in advance, designed to put her in exactly the position she was sitting in right now. And I had signed it. I had handed him everything he needed. I sat in that hard plastic chair under those flickering fluorescent lights, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't scared. I was something much colder than scared. I knew exactly who had done this, and I knew exactly where he was. They let us go home that night with a court date and a list of documents the legal aid attorney said we needed to gather as quickly as possible. The drive back was silent. Lily sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her forehead against the window, and I didn't push her to talk because I didn't have anything useful to say yet. I needed to think. The moment we got home, I sent her upstairs, told her to try to sleep, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and the copies of the documents the detective had given us. It was just past 9 at night. I didn't move from that table until almost 3 in the morning. The first thing I did was lay out every piece of paper in order: the registration document, the copy of the signed transfer paperwork, the insurance forms, the incident report from the hit and run. And then I started going through them line by line, the way I approach a complicated case at the hospital, methodically, without emotion, looking for what doesn't add up. It didn't take long before things started surfacing. On the insurance form, there was a policy number. I wrote it down. The coverage start date on that policy was the same backdated date as the registration, meaning whoever had set this up had not just filed a registration in Lily's name early. They had also taken out an insurance policy in her name on the same date, which meant they had her personal information well in advance. Her full name, her date of birth, her address. Jake had all of that. He'd asked me for it weeks before the party when he said he needed it for the venue guest list. I had sent it to him in a text message without a second thought. I found the text in my phone and stared at it for a long time. Then I went back to the transfer paperwork, the document I had signed at the party. I read every single word of it this time, slowly, in a way I should have done standing in that parking lot with a pen in my hand. On page 3, buried in a dense paragraph of legal language about liability and ownership transfer, was a clause that stated the effective date of ownership was established at the time of original registration filing rather than at the time of signing. In plain English, that meant the moment Jake filed that registration with Lily's name on it, she became the legal owner. My signature at the party hadn't transferred ownership, it had just confirmed it. Ratified a transaction that had already happened without either of us knowing. I sat back in my chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and just breathed for a minute. Then I pulled up the incident report again and looked at the date of the hit and run. A Saturday evening, 5 weeks after the party. I thought about what I knew about Jake's life during those 5 weeks. I knew he drove a lot. He'd mentioned once that he was doing some kind of contract work that had him moving between Dallas and Fort Worth regularly. I knew the intersection where the accident happened. It was on a route that made sense if you were coming from the west side of the city heading toward the highway. And then something clicked into place that made the hair on my arms stand up. 3 days after the party, Jake had called me. Just a check-in call, he said. Casual. But at one point he'd mentioned he'd had a minor fender bender and was getting his car looked at. I'd barely registered it at the time. Now I grabbed my phone and scrolled back through my call history until I found that conversation. I couldn't hear what he'd said, obviously, but I could see the date. It was 4 days after the hit and run. He hadn't had a fender bender. He'd struck a man on a bicycle and driven away. And then 4 days later, he'd called his sister to check in, calm as anything, while that man was still in a hospital bed. The rage that moved through me in that moment was unlike anything I'd felt in a long time. It wasn't hot and explosive. It was the opposite. It was cold and focused and clarifying in a way that almost frightened me. I understood the whole shape of it now. Jake had been driving the car before he gave it to us. He'd registered it in Lily's name weeks before the party, so that if anything happened while he was using it, the liability would already be established under her name. The party, the beau, the speech, the crowd, all of it was cover. A public record of generosity that he could point to if anyone questioned the timeline. And I had been the final piece. My signature on those papers was what made the whole thing bulletproof. Without it, there might have been questions about how a 16-year-old came to own a car. With it, there was a paper trail that looked like a family doing something nice for a kid's birthday. I closed my laptop. I stacked the documents into a neat pile and put them in a folder. I looked at the clock. It was 2:47 inches the morning. And without letting myself stop to reconsider, I picked up my keys off the counter, grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, and walked out to my car. Jake lived 20 minutes away. And I wasn't waiting until morning. Jake lived in a ground-floor apartment in a complex off Maple Avenue, the kind of place with a pool nobody used, and a gate that was always propped open with a brick. I'd been there maybe twice in the past year. I knew which unit was his because he'd texted me a photo when he first moved in, proud of the space in that way he always was when something new came into his life before he got bored of it. I parked in the lot and sat in my car for about 30 seconds. Not to calm down. I was already calm. That was the part that scared me a little. I got out and walked to his door and knocked. It was almost 3 in the morning. I didn't care. The light under the door told me he was still up. A few seconds passed, then I heard movement inside, and then the door opened and Jake stood there in a t-shirt and sweatpants, looking surprised for exactly 1 second before his face rearranged itself into something more careful. He looked at me and said with a cautious smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Sarah, hey, it's late. What's going on?" I held up the folder. I said, looking straight at him without raising my voice, "I need you to tell me why my daughter's name is on a registration that was filed 3 weeks before you gave her that car." Something moved across his face. Fast. There and then gone. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms and said, keeping his voice even and relaxed, "I don't know what you're talking about. I filed the paperwork after the party like I told you I would." I told him the date on the registration said otherwise. He shrugged and said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "That's probably just how the DMV processes things. There's always a lag with those dates. You know how government offices are." Right then, a voice came from further inside the apartment. My mom's voice. She appeared behind Jake in the hallway, wrapped in a cardigan, her hair down, and I realized she was already there, which meant Jake had called her after I'd left the police station, which meant he'd known this was coming. She stepped forward and said in that tone she'd been using on me my whole life, the one that made everything I felt sound like an overreaction, "Sarah, honey, it's the middle of the night. Come inside and we'll talk about this calmly." I didn't move from the doorway. I looked at my mom and said, keeping every word deliberate, "The car was registered in Lily's name before the accident. The insurance was taken out in her name before the accident. And the paperwork I signed at the party had a backdated transfer clause buried in the fine print." My mom looked at Jake, just for a half second, but I caught it. Jake pushed off the doorframe and said, his voice shifting slightly, a little sharper now, "Look, I don't know where you're getting this information, but you're reading too much into some administrative dates. I did something nice for your daughter and now you're standing at my door at 3 in the morning, accusing me of what exactly?" I told him exactly. I said it plainly. That I believed he had been driving that car when it hit the cyclist. that he had registered it in Lily's name in advance specifically to avoid liability, that the party had been staged to create a public record of the gift so the timeline would look clean. The silence that followed, that was the loudest silence I have ever stood inside. Jake stared at me. My mom put her hand over her mouth, and then Jake did something that confirmed everything. He didn't get angry. He didn't deny it with any real force. He got very, very still, and then he said in a low, controlled voice that was nothing like his usual easy manner, "You need to be really careful about what you're saying right now." A different version of me might have backed down at that. Might have told herself she wasn't sure enough, that she should wait, that maybe there was another explanation. But I had spent the last 6 hours at a kitchen table going through every document line by line, and I was sure. So I said clearly, "I've already made copies of everything. The registration, the insurance, the incident report. The timeline doesn't work, Jake, and you know it. It was my dad who broke the standoff." I hadn't even realized he was there until he appeared in the hallway behind my mom, still in his work clothes like he hadn't been to bed yet either. He looked older than I remembered in that moment, tired in a way that went past that night. He looked at Jake for a long moment, and then he said with a quiet, weighted steadiness, "Jake, did you do this?" It wasn't a question. Not really. Jake's jaw tightened. He looked at my dad, then at my mom, then at the floor. And in that silence, in the way he couldn't find words, in the way his whole carefully constructed ease just collapsed in on itself, the answer was written plainly enough for all of us to read. My mom made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob and turned away toward the wall. My dad didn't move. He just kept looking at Jake with that same quiet, devastating steadiness. And Jake, for the first time in as long as I could remember, had nothing to say. I stood in that doorway with my folder of documents pressed against my chest, looking at my brother's silence, and felt the last thread of something I'd been holding onto for years finally give way. That night, everything in our family broke. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just quietly, in that hallway, under the fluorescent light of a cheap apartment in Dallas, with my dad's eyes on his son and no words left that were worth saying. 6 months have passed since that night in Jake's doorway, and my life looks nothing like it used to. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, things moved fast in the way that legal situations always do once the truth starts surfacing. The copies I'd made of every document went to a real attorney, one I paid for by pulling from the small emergency fund I'd spent 3 years building. She took one look at the timeline and told me we had a strong case. The backdated registration, the insurance policy opened in Lily's name before the party, the clause buried in the transfer paperwork, all of it pointed in one direction. Jake had been driving that car when it struck the cyclist. He had used my daughter as his exit strategy. Within 2 months, the investigation had shifted fully onto him. Witnesses from the area near the accident were re-interviewed. Security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the intersection placed a vehicle matching the Civic's description at that location around the time of the hit and run. Jake's phone records put him in that part of the city that evening. He hired a lawyer. It didn't help enough. He was charged with hit and run, filing fraudulent vehicle registration documents, and insurance fraud. He took a plea deal to avoid trial. He's serving 18 months. And will owe the cyclist restitution for medical bills and lost wages. All charges against Lily were dropped, completely. The moment the investigation established Jake as the driver and confirmed the registration had been fraudulently filed, her name was cleared. I sat in that courthouse hallway when the attorney told us and watched my daughter close her eyes and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for months. I didn't cry until I got to the car. My mom still isn't speaking to me. I don't know if she blames me for what happened to Jake, or if she just can't face what he did. But either way, the silence is there, and I've stopped trying to close that distance. It hurts. I won't pretend it doesn't. But I've learned that protecting your child and keeping the peace are not always the same thing, and when you have to choose, there is really only one answer. My dad is different. After that night in the apartment, he started calling me once a week. Nothing dramatic, just checking in, asking about Lily, sometimes just talking about nothing in particular. It's more than he gave me in the 10 years before this. I'll take it. As for Lily, she's in therapy now, and it's helping. She had nightmares for a while about the handcuffs, about the officers' voices, about the registration document with her name on it. She's working through it. She's stronger than she knows, that kid. Smarter too. She told me recently with a quiet certainty that sounded older than 16. I'm never signing anything I haven't read. Not ever. I told her that was the right call. That lesson cost us both more than it should have. The white Honda Civic is gone. I sold it the week after the charges were dropped. I didn't want it in my driveway. I didn't want Lily to have to look at it every morning. We're back to the 2009 Civic with the check engine light. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Here's what I want to leave you with. I trusted my brother because I wanted to believe that people who love you don't have the capacity to use you. I was wrong about that. Love and manipulation are not mutually exclusive. Some people will hand you something beautiful with one hand while they're setting a trap with the other. So before you sign, read everything. Before you trust, pay attention to what you're feeling in your gut, that quiet unease that showed up and that I chose to ignore. And before you assume that family means safety, remember that the people who know you best also know exactly where you're most vulnerable. Would you have trusted your brother in that parking lot? Would you have signed those papers with your daughter smiling in the background and a crowd of people cheering? I think a lot of you would have. I think most people would have. And that's exactly what he was counting on. If you've ever been in a situation where someone you loved used that love against you, I want to hear your story, because you are not alone, and neither was I, even when it felt that way.